Hi, I'm Francis Vigent, and this is Judy Higgins, my colleague here at Know Adam. Today, we're going to be talking about using thinking routines to learn how to learn science. Um, Judy, both of us have spent a lot of time in professional development ourselves, but also doing professional development with colleagues. Um, so ourselves as teachers, and I know you worked with Know Adam for 6 or 7 years, and I taught with Know Adam for 7 years. That's part of my experience. When you think about um, thinking and thinking routines, um, what comes to mind? Where do you think we go wrong with thinking in the classroom? And I've got a slide up here um, talking about thinking moves, and there's, I think, a connection there. But just in general, I know I've been guilty of asking my kids to think about something and kind of gotten some blank stares.
Mhm. Mhm. Agreed, agreed. And it's one of those, doesn't have to be complicated, but I know I often made it complicated when I would say things about, well, just think about it. Just tell me, what do you think about this? And that just automatically made my classroom go silent because students they really didn't understand what I was looking for. And so that became their journey. Like, what does Mrs. Higgins want now? And once I started recognizing that there were there was help out there that would help me engage my students in actual thinking and help them understand that there were many different kinds of thinking. There were all sorts of ways to think. And once I understood that and helped my students understand that, things became a lot more talkative. There were many more questions. Students started doing more of the talking as they engaged in thinking.
Mm,
And I think as scientists, I mean, it's all about thinking about what is happening here. Why is this happening? And it was one of the things that I really liked about No Adam was finding all of these supports that we had, these tools that we had to help the students take a look at what is thinking? What am I thinking about this? And suddenly there became formative assessment was so much easier because we both knew how to have a conversation of
mm,
what was going on, what were the questions, did I understand it or not? And if my students didn't understand it, there was help. Here are some questions that they felt safe asking.
mm.
I think both the thinking moves that we have here, and then we're going to talk about thinking routines, just started to I looked at I just did a training and we talked a lot about routines. And the title of that particular session was We Make Thinking and Learning Visible to Demystify, Inform, and Illuminate These Processes. And I liked that so much because I realized how much there were so many things that were a mystery to both myself and my students.
Mhm.
I was spending a lot of time sort of throwing things at them, giving things to them, and assuming they were learning.
Mhm.
I didn't have any way to really measure
Mhm.
learning. What do they think about this? Are they learning some of it? Do they have
Mhm.
a small grasp of it? Is that a doorway that we can all walk into? And I think that was the other thing is we often look at thinking as, well, you've got it or you don't.
Mm. Right, right, right.
Yeah, and to recognize, oh, okay, that's a crack into it. You're on
Mhm.
the right track. What do we do next?
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think that I think that a lot of teachers they end up in the pitfall of well, students aren't engaged because I don't have a good hook, or kids aren't engaged because they don't know how to ask questions, or they are used to being on video games, and this isn't like there's sort of like these like almost random but different explanations that come up.
Yeah.
But but one of the things I see in classrooms where those things often come up is that the learning environment is not being structured in a way to demystify thinking for the teacher and for the student.
Mhm.
And so when I think about, for example, Project Zero and Ron Richards' work, Mark Church, Morrison, and others, like the thinking moves that we have here that are entirely research based, that we're leaning on in No Atom across the lesson routine, a primary objective of teaching should be to make students thinking visible to themselves, to their peers, and to us, so that we can all learn from that. We can ask questions, we can pursue what is being made visible to better understand it. And I know we're going to get into that in a minute. Um, but actually calling out the thinking that we're looking for from our students as a way of, to your point, demystifying what it is we expect students to do when we ask them to think. And that's something Ron Richard brings up an awful lot. It's like when we ask students to think, what do we expect them to do? What do they think we want them to do? And and so when we think about these 8 thinking moves, actually communicating, I, as the teacher, I'm looking for my students to make connections in this activity. I'm looking for you as the student, Judy, to reason with evidence, to wonder, to uncover the complexity or go below the surface of what you're hearing and what you're seeing in your thinking. That's what I'm looking for. That's what I'm looking to identify as coming from you. And so it's not, what do you think about this? And the student interprets it as, do you have the right answer? Do you have what I want? Am I
Right.
looking for something? Mr. Vigent looking for something specific. I better give it to him. And if I can't, I better be quiet so he doesn't know that I don't know what he wants. um, to your point, kids get quiet when they aren't sure what our expectations are. And so a thinking routine then is a routine to help students. It's a framework. It's a routine to help them have a framework where they understand what thinking moves are involved at different parts of that process, so that we, to your point, have a shared language
Yeah.
and a shared set of expectations that we can use as a way of engaging in science together. And that's, I think, a key point. It's together. How do we come together as individuals in a group to to fill a role, to bring our ideas and our perspectives, to develop and use phenomena, to come to some conclusions in some way? Is Yeah, go ahead.
All right, go ahead and finish.
No. That's I wanted to give you a chance to jump in there.
Okay, but just before we leave this slide, one of the things that I think is so important about this list and considering different kinds of thinking, this is so helpful to students when we are recognizing, for example, making connections. For a student to realize, a student in particular who's overwhelmed, I'm struggling with reading, I don't understand this topic. When we start helping students make connections and students realize, oh, I already have some knowledge about this. Okay, I'm not in as much trouble as I thought. And
Mm,
that's amazing when you give a student that
mhm,
they have something to bring to the table because they've made a connection and that they've already got some thinking going on about that.
mm,
And then the other one that I think is so important is the reasoning with evidence, because when we were simply looking for the right answer, well, that's right, and now you're done. and helping students understand, I can't just say this, I have to back it up. And
Mhm.
that is, again, it's so powerful in a classroom because that becomes an expectation and students can ask that of each other. And that's such a great power for students when, if students are building a prototype together
Mhm.
and they recognize they have the right and the responsibility to say, well, I don't understand why you want to put A right next to C,
Mhm.
and expecting that of each other. Give me some thoughts as to why you're doing this, because
Mhm.
I don't understand, so I don't think it's a logical move. And for young students, that's so powerful. And when we start expecting that at kindergarten,
Mhm.
that's when just so many important things happen when students learn that,
Mhm.
you know, we have to reason with evidence. We have to defend our thinking. We have to have thoughts about why we're going to do this. And again, helping them identify. That's more thinking.
Mhm. And I think you bring up a really interesting point that as we're moving on here to talk about the way these thinking moves come together to form routines and the way we use those routines to engage, is that I feel like perhaps it's the increased focus on social emotional learning.
Mhm.
Um, we used to talk about the 4 C's and the 5 C's and so on, and now in social emotional learning, we still talk about these things. We talk them in a slightly different way, but again, it's a renewed focus on things like communication, collaboration, and so on, just in a larger context. And I think that in the classroom, in a K-12 context, so much of collaboration has a kind of social focus that unfortunately it's not going. I don't think it is. People aren't aware yet that there's such thing as intellectual collaboration as well. There's a
Mhm.
cognitive collaboration that we can create in the classroom, so that the example you're giving, I'm hearing what you're saying, but I don't understand it. Tell me more about that. How are you making that connection? And that's coming peer to peer,
Yes.
not adult, child, student, teacher. And so in that way, we move away from that ping pong style discussion into that game of basketball as a team. That thinking becomes a team sport when we collaborate intellectually. And I think that that's a big part of what these thinking routines do. The thinking routines are a framework for students to apply those thinking moves, so that there's that shared language and those shared expectations. But what it also does is it creates a individual opportunity that also then becomes a group opportunity, so that I can share my thinking, I can share it with others, and we can think about that together. But also others are going to share their thinking with me, and I can think about that. So it's again this sort of like collaboration on a cognitive level.
Mhm.
So let's dive into this picture thinking routine. This is one that we use in NoAtom, or we suggest people use for nonfiction reading, where we have images on the page, and we don't want students to bother coding or decoding or reading that text. We want them to focus on the image. And this is a kind of visual reading strategy where, whether a child is an English learner, they're reading at grade level and not at grade level, doesn't matter. We want them to look, let's say this is the image, and identify one object and one action and one property that they notice. And it's completely up to them,
Mhm.
but they only get one of each. Their peers may notice different things. And while they're at it, we want them to come up with a word or a phrase for what they think they're going to learn about on that page where the image is. That's it. And What we then do is I, as the teacher, will read that page aloud and ask my students, what's it really about? How's your thinking changed? And my goal here is to get students to look at what they noticed, look at what they thought this was going to be about. And by the way, we would have shared that out before I read the page. So they would have had a chance to hear what others noticed and what others thought that page was about. But then now that they've heard it, what's it really about? And so kids start going backwards, and maybe what they thought that page was about isn't really what it's about, but the things that they noticed are connected differently. And so they dive into trying to understand more deeply, but also connect what others were noticing as a way of sort of informing their thinking and helping to make connections in different ways. So that's the basics of this thinking routine. But Judy, I wanted to create some space for you here. In using this routine yourself and seeing others use this routine, how is this a thinking routine, and how does this take shape in a classroom, like your classroom or others you've seen?
I love this thinking routine, and using it really changed so many of the dynamics in my classroom. And there were so many things that happened. First of all, students became so much more relaxed. And I see this constantly when, I don't have to read anything. Nope, we're just focusing on the pictures. And that took such a level of stress out of things, and students who were not necessarily engaged, because in their mind, here comes the reading, I can't do it well, and so I'm checking out. And the pictures, I mean, pictures are very engaging. So this process of identifying an object action property, it's so powerful because it's what you notice, what's important to you. And I realized how little time I gave that in my teaching. It was all about, I knew what they needed to notice.
Mm,
And that's what I was going to focus on. And it made me a little bit nervous. Like, yikes, what if they're not noticing the things I want them to notice? And I had to let go of that. And that's when it became so enjoyable, because I started respecting my students so much more,
mm,
because they were really taking it very seriously. And then comes the next part where we're teaching them to take some risks,
mhm,
what I think it tells us, and to do some justification,
mhm,
like you notice this. Now, what do you think is going to go on next? Which I saw this as such a guaranteed way to get them excited about the reading
mm,
they're about to do, because they've all made these predictions,
mm,
and suddenly they're engaged. I
mhm,
wonder, was my thinking correct? Did I
mhm,
notice the right quote unquote things?
mhm,
But it's all about them. And then, so you've got now students are more engaged with the reading. They were listening to sort of think about, well, was I looking for what I noticed? How did that fit with things? And then,
mhm,
as Francis said, we talk about it. And then you get to that really powerful place of, how has my thinking changed? And one of the really important things that I see many students learn from this, my thinking changing doesn't necessarily mean my thinking was wrong.
mm,
My thinking maybe was just at the surface.
mhm,
Oh, well, listening to everybody else talk about it, oh, I can see where maybe we are going to go a little bit more in the direction that they talked about.
mhm,
So you're starting to teach your students to be aware of different perspectives and
mhm,
consider those. So it becomes such a great whole class project that we're already sort of setting that up. We're working together, we're figuring this out together. So
Mhm.
you're creating a lot of curiosity and listening.
Mhm.
And it took me a little bit to teach this routine, but then once everybody got it, it was we used this so much and we use this in
Mhm.
so many different ways. It's a
Mhm.
really powerful routine.
Mhm.
And so much thinking is made visible as you listen and
Mhm.
maybe add on to the conversation. But there's so much student-led conversation
Mhm.
because they're very invested
Mhm.
in these interesting pictures. And you're starting them on the journey of
Mhm.
a lot of connections as they look at the
Mhm.
pictures.
What I love about this too is what you've been describing in students' anticipation of what's this really about? This is what I think it's about. They've taken that risk is that they, by giving them this agency, by doing this release of responsibility and empowering them to take these risks, we've also created not just engagement, but a desire to listen for understanding and a desire to unpack the real meaning here and to connect. So when we go back to those thinking moves, uncovering complexity, making connections, wondering and asking why, like this framework of a picture thinking routine is creating a task focused on the thinking. It's it's incentivizing thinking, but it's also incentivizing other things that we talk about all the time in class. I want you to listen for understanding, to a second grader, um, or even an eighth grader that can have a very vague meaning. But in this case, it's very clear. Students are listening to figure out if the connections they made, if the meaning that they've projected onto this, that they've inferred, actually is the meaning, or if it's something different. And then they're going back through that process in a sense to make new connections if perhaps the connections that they made were a little bit off in some way. And again, I like that point that you're making that it doesn't mean my thinking was wrong.
Mhm,
It
mhm.
just means I might have been thinking about something unrelated, which
Right,
doesn't
right.
make it wrong. It just means it's unrelated to this particular context. Um,
And
so
one of the,
yeah.
just to wrap this one up,
Mhm.
I've seen so many classrooms, so many different classrooms, so many different ages use this so successfully. And I've seen it over and over and over again, and often teachers who are trying it for the first time
Mhm.
and really enjoying what we ended the last session that we had, and you asked me about, how do we bring joy back into the classroom?
Mhm.
And this is so often one of those situations where I see a teacher just grinning and being so engaged along with the students
Mhm.
as they, speculate, but to look at how invested everybody is in this situation.
Mhm.
And that's such a joyful thing when you see everybody thinking, and it's not a terrifically complicated thing that you had to create. It's a,
Mhm.
and you can use it you use it over and over and over again at every single
Mhm.
level.
Mhm. And I love that you're pointing that out because once students understand the routine, they can use it in many different contexts, which makes it a way of engaging with ideas, in this case, with reading, with pictures in the reading. And people may look at this at first blush and say, oh, I do gallery walks. We look at the pictures on the page and we look at, text features and so on. This is not that. This is something very different. Um, because of the nuance. The nuance gives this greater value. It has the value and more that you might be anticipating, and it's almost magical. Like I agree. Like when you see this happening, it's like, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know that that student had that connection, that idea, or that they would go there. But like, I'm surprised and I'm glad I didn't take that opportunity away from them by trying to transfer some knowledge as opposed to letting them connect and uncover and really understand how their ideas anchor here. So that brings us to another thinking routine, which often, like, we encourage folks to use and transition to Socratic dialogue, which is concept mapping. So Judy, maybe you want to talk a little bit about concept mapping and how that works, and really what a concept map is. Like, if we ask students to concept map, what are we really asking them to do here?
Right. So concept mapping is, again, it's one of those really powerful tools, and probably one of my favorites in terms of watching every single student be able to enter this in some way. So what this is we take the vocabulary from each unit. So we use these throughout all the grade levels, throughout every single unit that we are presenting, and they have this concept map. And there's a lot of different ways that you can use it. You can use it as kind of a pre-assessment, just to give it to students. And this is the important thing. Don't have any expectations about how they're going to connect things. You're, once again, just like with the picture thinking, you are looking for their connections. What are the connections that we're making? And the expectation is that they're going to make a note or two so that they're justifying the connection. You take away all the pressure in terms of, some of you may connect one, some of you may connect three. I'm not looking for any number, I'm not looking for any specifics, just go ahead. You may not make any connections first time around. And this is something that I used throughout each unit, so that they hung on to this. They just would put this into their binder, and they could pull it out anytime they were making new connections. This was an amazing way for me to be able to get some idea of where were they, what kind of connections were they making, where was the understanding, what should we need to focus on. And again, one of those low pressure, this isn't a test, I have no expectations. And I liked it so much because it helps students throughout the grade levels start to connect. Oh, wait, we learned something about this in second grade. I remember this about it. So it really starts to help students think about, this sounds familiar. I know I have something that goes with this, or I have a personal experience that I can make a connection. And this we can use during the reading, before the reading, after the reading, all those kinds. And I think one of the things that I used that was great was often during reading, as opposed to if some kids struggled with, I don't know how to take notes, I don't even know what that means. But during the reading, grab it and make a connection. And that again is keeping them focused on the reading. And again, being able to say, wait, let me look at that. And then I would often give my students a little bit of time after reading to work in pairs. And that was one of those great moments when you'd see students going back into the reading. Wait a minute, we saw something about this. Let's go back and check this out so we can justify this connection. So it can be, students can do it alone. They can do it in a group of two, in a group of four, as a team. And we can use this as our lead into our discussion. When students are going to bring this, and they can talk about the connections that they made, or they can ask questions about, did anybody connect this with this? I couldn't figure out how to connect that. So a lot of opportunities for really good discourse, a lot of opportunities to learn from others. What are you bringing to the table that I didn't know about? And a lot of opportunities to talk about, well, why did I connect these things? And
Mhm.
reinforce that you're expected to give a reason. How do these two things connect? And quite
Mhm.
often, this was again one of those, joyful teacher moments when I would hear a connection and think, I don't, I don't get that. I don't see that,
Mhm.
but not assuming anything. And to
Right.
ask, tell me about that. And that's so exciting when a student can say, well, at home, I learned about this, and
Mhm.
that was my connection. May or may not be a great connection, but even if it's either, we're gonna have to think about that one a little bit more. Let's put that over in the parking lot and talk about it. Or
Mhm.
that opportunity, if it's an incorrect connection,
Mhm.
there's, there's your formative assessment to like, well, let's talk about that. And so often students would say, oh, I thought I was confusing it with this word. Great. That's a great way exposing your thinking.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, what I love about this tool is you mentioned vocabulary and you mentioned the reading, and like if we zoom out a little bit further, is like we've got this phenomena that we're engaging with. And so with something like the picture thinking routine that we just looked at, students are connecting whatever's in their experience in their mind, their funds of knowledge, with the phenomena as they see it in those images. And
Yes.
then they hear some about it and they've taken some risks and they get some new connections and some things start to clarify and connect in new ways. And then we put something like this in front of them, and yeah, it has the vocab, but it's not only the vocab from the particular lesson we're in. It might be vocab from other lessons, but it goes beyond the vocab because it's the big ideas that are a part of this lesson in this unit. So we're creating, so this thinking routine is creating an opportunity for students to use their thinking moves to make new connections, to reinforce, and to actually see in a way a bunch of possibilities. And so they have to look at those possibilities and say, well, yeah, these are possibilities, but are they actually connections? How do I see these connected? And to your point, they could be doing this maybe in a group, they could be doing this individually, they could be doing this sharing out, going on gallery walks. Like there's lots of different ways to use this at different points in a lesson, and even using different color pen or pencil so that as they go through pre, post, at different points in that lesson routine, pulling this out, they can see the growth in their own thinking and the connections that they're making.
Yes. Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to add in was I would often make a large chart and it would just go on the wall. And so students could make connections as they occurred. What I really liked about that was students recognizing that this is a constant throughout every step that we're doing in science. We're always learning. So
Mhm.
it's not, we're not after just one thing. Well, I already get that, so I'm done. We're
Mhm.
constantly learning, whether
Mm.
it's from, making a giant mistake or figuring out a new way to do something,
Mhm.
trying and trying and trying with this prototyping, and finally, oh, whoa, we just got that. And we're really excited
Mm.
about that to
Mm.
go up and put that on the chart so we can remember to talk about it later on is
Mm.
really powerful. And I always really liked that we saw learning as a constant.
Mm.
Now you're all ready for the test, so we can move on, that it's living, breathing learning.
Yeah, and I guess I think about this too as we're talking, we kind of keep coming back to it, but I think you and I take for granted what others might be a little unsure of here is that it's like we're talking, even so we have these thinking routines that are something that we are using with reading throughout the year constantly. We have something like concept maps that we're using with every lesson throughout the year, constantly. But then we're talking about students in each of these making their thinking visible to themselves and to others and to us. So they're learning how to learn. They're learning this as a tool for engaging with the discipline. We're learning them as learners and as students and their understanding and skill set around the standards. But I also think that it could be easy to overlook that you and I are also talking about this culture that we're building of like almost like flexibility, the risk taking that students, like you said a moment ago, they make a connection now. 3 days from now, they may go back and change that connection. They might clarify it. They might see it as an error and connect in a different way. And that's okay. And that's something we're encouraging as part of this authentic learning experience. And I think we're communicating to them through the use of these routines, a kind of safe space for risk taking, but also this idea that it's not about the right or wrong answer in the moment. It's about participating in a process of growth,
Yeah.
um, which I think is just so important because I think it's often lost. I think at times. And I think it's what makes learning scary for students. And I think it maybe makes it scary for teachers too, because on two sides, I think as teachers, we want students to get the right answer. So we have a known answer. So giving up freedom is scary. Giving up that control is scary to us as teachers. The flip side, as a student, if you understand learning to be having the right answer and you don't have the right answer, learning is scary. But when teachers give up that control, learning becomes fun and engaging, and it seems more possible, I
Mhm.
think, to students to actually be able to learn.
Yes, and I think, you had written here unresolved from earlier thinking, hunches, questions, wonders, confusions, realizations, and connections. In a, I think about a wonderful world where confusion is acceptable. And
Mhm.
we're honoring that. And just because you said something, you can, as you said, that was a really good point you brought up, that you can change that based on
Mhm.
what I learned. That's the exciting thing. So
Mhm.
based on my thinking, based on the way I'm understanding it now, I need to tweak, maybe not 100% change, but I need to tweak what I said, and providing the space and not only accepting that, but celebrating that. And
Mhm.
when discourse kicks in, when we can have such wonderful, vibrant conversations about first I thought, and now I think, because of what happened, that
Mhm.
we learned from, oh, that didn't work at all. Our first attempt was not great because of this, but we learned.
Exactly. And so that kind of brings me, I guess, to our next slide around that lesson routine. So this is an example of No Adams lesson routine and where the two tools we just talked about fit. And so in a middle school classroom teaching science every day, this might be Monday through Friday, 5 days of the week. Or in a first or second grade class, this might fall over a week to a week and a half, depending on, if we're teaching science 2 days a week or three, and how many minutes that is, because I know I was self-contained um, in the classroom, and so folks are teaching like all the disciplines as opposed to only science. But when when we think about a lesson unfolding, it's helpful to think about a series of routines or a series of habits and behaviors that we have shared with students so that they're comfortable in how to engage in reading and how to engage in Socratic dialogue or in planning an investigation with scientific process or with engineering design process. Because the more that's shared, it's not sort of special teacher speak, something we keep to ourselves or that has only relevance, in the context of of what we do in our classroom, but it's actually something that we can generalize and we could use if we're at, reading a newspaper, or if we are having a conversation with friends at their house, or, whatever it is, and students then can carry that forward with them. And I guess one of the things we've been touching on is, how, and I'd love to get your input on this, Judy, is like how much are these routines central to how students should be learning science, and these routines as tools for how to engage in science when I'm in Miss Higgins' class.
Well, I think we help, like, this as a teacher, this visual was so helpful for me to really think about, I felt really overwhelmed when I started teaching science, and how was I going to sort of control this process? And there were so many steps. And just seeing this routine helped me think about, we're not going to do it all at once. And I don't have to have any preconceived notions about what my students know or don't know at this point, because we're we're starting with the picture thinking, which is going to make the reading accessible and exciting to them. And then, and that's, you know, that's where we begin. And I'm not going to worry about getting there yet, because there's a lot of thinking that's going to go on. And then being able to take the time with the discussion. And that, that was something I think as a teacher, I did not make the time for that a lot, because I constantly felt like I had no time. And I see that a lot. But once I saw the importance of, I was spending 3 days doing the reading over and over and over again because nobody understood it. And when I took that pressure off myself and my students, it's okay if they don't understand it first time around. That is okay. Everybody will enter it at some different levels, but we'll move into the concept mapping and have a discussion around that, which will take us all to the next step. Oh, my learning and understanding is growing. I'm starting to have ideas. And then moving into the scientific process, which is its own routine. And we're already taking, to enter the scientific process, we've already learned a lot about, my hypothesis may not be correct first time around. I have to do some research here. I have to figure out. It's not a guessing game. And I think that's what happens so often. Is first it was just like a guessing game. Let me do that so I can move on to the next thing. And looking at this as a routine and as a process that we kept entering step by step. And I had the ability to assess where are we at each step. I see their understanding. Are they showing me that they understand before they move on to the next step? So when this big mess of a student saying to me right before they start the investigation, if I would say, well, talk to me about your hypothesis. What hypothesis? And, shame on me. It's like, whoa, we are very much, not on the same, not in the same routine, not thinking the same way. How did I miss that? Because I hadn't been doing the routines of checking in and making sure you're understanding, and you're understanding, I'm making this hypothesis based on research. So now I can move on to the next steps.
Well, what I love about these thinking routines is that they are, their whole purpose, in a sense, is to create a space for thinking and then to make the product of thinking visible to the learner and to the teacher and to the peers in the class, so that everybody can be seeing that, attempting to understand it, to work with it, to build on it. And what I love about this sequence of sort of this lesson routine and that we're showing here in this visual is, when you think about the way that the learning happens, it another way to think to say what you were saying a moment ago is that we're leaving a kind of wet edge constantly, where there's whatever's happening, there's these, like, it's almost like a plant growing. There's these tendrils going out from a student's thinking and their connections and what's in their mind at that moment about this particular set of phenomena and the way it appears and the way it works. And those tendrils bump into things. They bump into other people's thinking, which might be very fertile, and they grow in that direction. Or they bump into someone else's thinking or their own realization that something doesn't work this way, it doesn't connect this way. And so they change shape and they go in a new direction. And that, that is really quite amazing as a teacher to watch.
Yes.
I know it was for me, and I think it helps. We talked about this before, you and I, in a different session, is that it helps me. I need to trust my students have the ability to engage in thinking, that they're actually capable of thinking. But by creating these kind of high quality opportunities and structures for them to engage, and then seeing this happen, to me, it's further evidence that I can trust them, that I can release that responsibility, and that I don't need to view the learning environment as, I have this set of things I want students to understand. We do something, then I check for understanding, and if they don't understand it, we do that again, and we just keep doing it and doing it over and over again until either everybody knows everything or everybody's so sick of this that we just all run away, because that's not as authentic as what we're talking about here. This is, again, it's this kind of growth process. And I think it's rooted in the standards as well. I mean, this is the way, certainly I know we view standards here, but this is the way that the standards, that with the exception of Texas, Florida, and Georgia, states really are an adaptation or a blanket adoption of next generation science standards, which have those three parts: the foundations of disciplinary core ideas, the science and engineering practices, and the cross-cutting concepts. And the standard itself is something that students are expected to be able to perform in the context, in a novel context, involving related phenomena. So when you think of mastery, Judy, and you think about these different dimensions, I mean, do you see these as things that I know many people try to teach in isolation? Try to let's front load content. So, we're gonna focus on disciplinary core ideas for a month, and then I'm gonna pre-teach science and engineering practices, and we're gonna focus on that. And I have these visuals around cross-cutting concepts, and then bring it all together at the end, like it's going to happen that way. Is that really how it works? Does it work in isolation like that, or does it work somewhat differently?
No, and I think this was one of the things that was helpful to me as a teacher when I was, of course, as we all are, nervous about, I have to teach these standards. And once I relaxed and recognized that by teaching my students how to think, how are they going to get to understanding, how to make connections, they're going to be able to make those connections that is going to get them to the standards. Because while, we try to cover all of this ground with everything that they might be presented with, which is impossible, as opposed to helping them be thinkers, helping them understand so that they can play with things. Well, I don't don't exactly know this, but given what we learned about this, oh, this is obvious. It's going to act in some way in the same way. And I think that's one of those, again, those trust issues when you help students become confident, creative thinkers. I mean, and studies show this, there's lots and lots of data that shows they are able to understand. They
Mm,
are able to go to, I get this, I just have to look at it in a different context.
mhm,
Students don't know how to do that. I don't know the answer to that question at all. Done.
mhm,
I would hear that so much. You didn't teach us any of this.
mhm,
And that's just heartbreaking and
mhm,
shame on me,
mhm,
because it wasn't that I didn't teach them that specific thing. I wasn't
mhm,
helping them become thinkers.
mm. And it reminds me of this quote, um, which is making thinking visible in action, where learning happens at the point of challenge. And so I remember instances like that. I mean, I remember I started my career as a high school math teacher, and I remember students saying to me, "You never taught us this." And it was because our approach to math in that school when I started was drill and kill. And
Mhm.
so the expectation was if you could drill and kill enough of the facts of how you multiply this and divide by that to come to whatever answer, that students should be able to generalize that and synthesize when they encounter a challenge. But the reality was that it didn't, because the classroom environment that I presented them was drill and kill. They had not been approached with a context that they processed, that they were challenged by, and so they didn't come to a deep understanding of the hows and whys. They became used to plug and chug, where they go, oh, try to recognize a pattern, fit this into that, and add, multiply, divide, and you get the right answer. And that's hard. That's because you don't have mastery. You're not able to perform the expectations. And I think about it even in another context. I think about my son as a learning to walk as a toddler. And it was always interesting to me that he learned to walk and he could walk and run around inside very well. But if we took him outside, then he struggled because the ground was uneven and it wasn't smooth, and it was bumpy, and there were rocks, and there were things that he had not developed a skill set to cope with. And so he had not encountered those challenges before. So I think about, just like for him, our yard was a kind of classroom where he encountered new and different challenges that he learned to overcome. That became part of his skill set. I think about the classroom as in science as teachers, we want or should be seeking to engage students thinking in the phenomena and the context so that they can begin processing that. And the way that they're going to process it is by attempting the skills to develop the content, to make connections through their thinking, and form the answers to questions and solutions to problems for themselves, as opposed to the plug and chug pattern recognition and recall and all the stuff that is part of sort of the tradition of education that we're trying to all move away from. And I think that kind of brings us to um, to the two final points is, what is understanding by design in a lesson or a unit these days? It's it's designing lessons and units the way NOADM does, from the standards and clusters, so that students are engaged with actually developing and using the content with the skills and with their thinking in different situations with each other in different parts of that lesson routine, um, so that that they're developing a skill set to deal with different terrain. And it's not about trying to learn every possible situation. It's about learning a skill set that's useful in every possible situation. Um, and so I guess the last piece that we've been sort of dancing around here, and I know we're basically at time and want to wrap up, but there's at least under the current standards, there's this new partnership between students and teachers. So, Judy, I don't know if this is something maybe you want to talk a little bit more about, because it touches on a lot of the points you've already brought up here.
So much, so much. And I just love this whole visual that we're all doing this together. We're having discussions together. We're learning together. And it really changed my view of myself as a teacher. And when I had the freedom to, I don't know everything, because that was always my terror. I felt like I needed to know everything. And I had to avoid questions that I couldn't answer. And when I could model me as a learner too, when I could model risk taking, it really changed everything for me as a teacher. And again, going back to when the last session Francis had asked, what is joy in the classroom? And that's joy when it's so much easier to be a teacher, when it's not all up to you. You want to create the safe environment, but you have these students who know how to take risks, we all encourage each other to take risks. And you're always learning about each other. You're always learning about thinking, and grading becomes so much easier when you're constantly doing all of this formative assessment in the moment. So my husband and I were talking the other day about, my husband was saying, well, I never knew what my grades were going to be in school. It was just like, I hope I did well, but I had no idea. And I thought I said, oh my gosh, that was such an interesting point. And because it shouldn't be like that, we should all know, how much have I learned? Do I get this? And if I don't get it, that's okay. Let's have a discussion and ask the questions. So that's my wrap up.
Yeah. And I guess what I would add to that is that I remember being in the classroom and teaching this way. And to your point about the joy, I remember these moments where my students would all be sort of actively learning, and they're engaged as scientists and engineers developing their plans with their partner and so on. And I felt like here I am sort of standing, like leaning up against my desk, watching this all happen, and kind of like, am I doing my job? Like, I have nothing to do right now in a sense, but sort of watch this unfold. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I wonder what the principal's going to think when they walk by. Like, I'm going to just see chaos in my room and think, Francis just let the kids go, and like, are they actually learning anything? Like, what's he doing? But then I came to realize that actually it was so great in a way, it was a validation I had done my job, because my students were taking that space and that agency, and they were taking the learning so seriously and taking the phenomena so seriously that I really could act as a coach, and I really could focus on meeting their individual needs as students and as team members. And they were doing the thinking and they were doing the heavy lifting. And I could act as an observer, as a reflective thinker in that process, and help model, to your point, the curiosity, and how magical that was. And like all this other busy work, the paperwork, all these other things didn't matter. That didn't really create the value that I thought it created. It was really, I could do without it. And that was really reassuring. And so I think when when you're teaching in this model, it is in some sense freeing, but I also find it very reassuring. So wonderful. Well, thank you, Judy, for your time. I just will share with everybody our email addresses if they want to get in touch, or if they want to check any of this out on the website. They can get in touch with us, jhiggins@noadam.com, or fvigent@noadam.com, or you can go to noadam.com and download a thinking routine, a resource, even a sample unit and reader, and try some of this on your own and see what it's like. Hopefully you have the same experience we have. Anything else you'd like to add, Judy?
Nope, just thank you.
Thank you. All right, take care. I'm going to